Have you ever gone completely silent on someone and still felt like nothing changed? You stop texting, you stop calling, you stop checking, you do everything you are told. Just go no contact. And yet, your mind is still stuck on them, still replaying memories, still waiting for something to shift. So here is the uncomfortable truth most people never tell you. No contact is not enough, not even close. And if you are honest with yourself, you already feel it. Because silence on the outside does not automatically create peace on the inside. You can remove a person from your life, but still carry them inside your thoughts every single day. And that is where most people get trapped. They think no contact is a switch. You turn it on and suddenly you become powerful. Suddenly the other person feels your absence. Suddenly everything changes. But human psychology does not work like that. Because attachment is not controlled by distance alone. It is controlled by emotional wiring. By identity, by internal need. When you cut contact but your emotions stay loud, your mind does something very predictable. It fills the silence with hope. It creates fantasies. It builds scenarios where the other person comes back, regrets everything, realizes your worth. And this is not strength. This is withdrawal. Just like a brain reacting to addiction. Because emotional connection works like a chemical loop. Dopamine does not just disappear because you stop talking to someone. It lingers, it repeats, it searches for the same emotional hit again and again. That is why no contact feels painful in the beginning. Not because you are weak, but because your brain is adjusting to absence. And here is where most people make a silent mistake. They believe time alone will fix everything. They think if they just wait long enough, the attachment will fade on its own. But time without transformation is just repetition. You are not healing, you are just enduring. And while you are enduring, your energy is still attached, still focused on them, still emotionally available in your mind, even if you never send a message. This is why some people go weeks or months of no contact and still feel stuck in the same emotional place. Because no contact removes access, but it does not remove attachment. And that is the real difference most people never understand. Now think about this deeply. Why would someone feel your absence? If you are still emotionally living in that connection every day, energy is not just what you show, it is what you feel consistently. And the human mind is incredibly sensitive to that invisible signal. So when your internal state is still, I miss them, I hope they come back, I wonder what they are doing, then no contact becomes just a physical action, not a psychological shift. And that is why it often fails to create impact on the other person. Because the strongest change does not come from silence, it comes from detachment. Not coldness, not revenge, not pretending, real detachment. The kind where your mind is no longer emotionally living in the past connection. But here is the part most people struggle to accept. You cannot fake this state. You cannot force your way into it just by blocking someone or deleting their number. Because if your identity is still the person who was attached, then your behavior will eventually reflect that energy again. That is human psychology. So no contact alone becomes incomplete. It is only the first step, a surface level action. But underneath, your emotional system is still active, still reacting, still searching. And this is exactly why so many people break no contact. Not because they didn't understand the rule, but because they never changed the internal dependency behind it. So the real question is not, how long should I do no contact? The real question is, what am I doing with my mind while I am in no contact? Because if nothing changes inside you, then nothing truly changes in your outcome. And this is where the deeper truth begins. Most people think the goal is to make the other person feel their absence. But the real power shift begins when you stop needing that result at all. When your focus moves away from reaction and returns to rebuilding yourself at an emotional level. And if you continue watching, you will understand something most people never figure out. You will see why avoidant personalities in particular do not respond to silence the way you expect. And more importantly, you will discover what actually shifts their perception at a psychological level, because it is not distance alone. It is not waiting longer. It is not silence for the sake of silence. There is something deeper happening underneath behavior. And once you understand it, your entire approach to no contact changes forever. What keeps someone occupying your thoughts long after everything has ended is not the person themselves. It is the unfinished emotional loop your mind refuses to close. The human brain is not designed to release emotional patterns instantly. it is designed to complete them. When something feels unresolved, the mind treats it like an open task that still needs an answer. This is why, even in silence, even in distance, even after cutting communication completely, the mental presence of that person can remain active. It is not a choice you are making consciously, it is a pattern running automatically in the background. When emotional connection ends without closure, the brain does something very specific. It keeps replaying fragments of memory, searching for meaning. It tries to decode what went wrong, what could have been done differently, and whether the outcome could still change. This creates a cycle of repetitive thinking that feels like reflection, but in reality, it becomes mental repetition without progress. This is where most people misunderstand their own mind. They assume thinking about someone means love is still strong. But in psychological terms, constant thinking often signals unresolved emotional tension, not deep affection. The mind returns to what feels incomplete, not necessarily what feels valuable. Another hidden mechanism involved here is unpredictability. When a connection was inconsistent, when attention came and went, when emotional signals were unclear, the brain becomes more engaged instead of less. Uncertainty activates deeper focus. The mind becomes addicted to finding patterns in inconsistent behavior because it believes a solution is hidden somewhere in the inconsistency. This is why letting go feels harder than expected. The brain is not only processing loss, it is also processing confusion. And confusion is powerful enough to keep attention locked in place. Even when logic says, move on, the emotional system continues scanning for missing pieces. There is also a deeper layer connected to identity. When someone becomes emotionally significant, they are not stored in memory as just a person. They become linked with self-image, expectations, and future projections. So when the connection breaks, it does not feel like losing a person alone. It feels like losing a version of yourself that existed within that dynamic. This is why your thoughts return again and again. Your mind is not only remembering them, it is trying to restore balance in your internal identity system. It keeps revisiting the past because it is still adjusting to the absence of a role that once shaped your emotional world. Another strong force behind this mental attachment is what psychology calls reinforcement patterns. When emotional reward was unpredictable, the brain becomes more persistent. If attention, affection, or validation was not consistent, every moment of connection becomes more memorable. The mind values inconsistency more than stability because inconsistency creates anticipation, and anticipation strengthens memory loops. So even after everything ends, your brain does not treat it as finished. It treats it as something that could return at any moment. This expectation keeps emotional alertness active, which feeds continuous thinking. There is also an emotional echo effect. Strong emotional experiences do not fade linearly. They fade in waves. A random trigger, a sound, a place, or even a thought can reactivate the entire emotional pattern instantly. When that happens, the mind relives not just the memory, but the feeling attached to it. And feelings are what keep thoughts alive. This is why healing is not about forcing thoughts away. Suppression only strengthens them. The mind resists being controlled in that way. The more you try to stop thinking, the more attention you give to the thought itself. And attention is fuel. Real change begins when the internal system no longer finds emotional reward in the repetition. When thinking about the person no longer creates emotional activation, the loop slowly weakens on its own. But until that shift happens, the mind keeps returning because it is still trying to resolve emotional discomfort. There is also an ego component most people overlook. The mind struggles to accept experiences where emotional investment did not lead to expected outcomes. So it replays scenarios in an attempt to regain a sense of control. It wants to rewrite the story in a way that feels more balanced or justified. This silent resistance keeps the mental connection alive even when external contact is gone. What feels like missing someone is often the mind resisting acceptance of uncertainty. The brain prefers painful clarity over unclear endings. That is why it keeps thinking, analyzing, and revisiting moments long after they are over. Over time, this repetition becomes familiar, and familiarity creates comfort, even if it is painful. The mind can become attached not to the person, but to the habit of thinking about them. This creates a deeper layer of dependency that most people never recognize. So even when you believe you are trying to move on, part of your attention may still be anchored in that habitual loop. And that is why progress often feels slow or inconsistent. Because internally, the cycle is still active. Understanding this changes everything because it reveals that the issue is not lack of strength and not lack of discipline. It is a neurological and emotional loop that continues until it is no longer reinforced internally. And once you begin to see that clearly, the focus naturally starts shifting away from the external person and back toward the internal patterns keeping them alive in your mind. Avoidant behavior is often misunderstood as emotional superiority or lack of feeling, but in reality, it is rooted in protection. The avoidant mind is trained to maintain distance whenever emotional intensity becomes too close. This is not random. It is a learned survival response built over time through emotional experiences where closeness felt unsafe, overwhelming, or unpredictable. To understand why silence alone does not create the impact people expect, it is important to understand how an avoidant mind processes attachment. When emotional pressure increases, their instinct is not to move toward connection, but to move away from it. Distance creates relief for them, not panic. So when contact is removed without any deeper psychological shift, the avoidance system often stabilizes rather than reacts. This is where many people misread the situation. They assume absence automatically creates emotional urgency in the other person. But for an avoidance structure, absence can feel like breathing space instead of loss. The nervous system is no longer activated by emotional demand, so instead of chasing, it relaxes into independence again. However, there is a deeper layer that most people never consider. Avoidant individuals are not disconnected from emotion. They are highly sensitive internally, but they regulate emotion by suppressing it before it becomes overwhelming. This means their reactions are delayed, not absent. What appears as indifference is often delayed processing combined with emotional control. This is why timing alone does not influence them. What influences them is perception of emotional availability versus emotional withdrawal on a deeper level. If the system still senses emotional access, even without communication, the internal distance is not fully registered. And without that full psychological separation, there is no internal disruption. Avoidant psychology also operates heavily on perceived control. When they feel they are in control of emotional proximity, they remain detached. But when that sense of control is quietly removed, not through confrontation but through genuine internal independence, their emotional system begins to recalibrate. This recalibration does not happen instantly. It happens in stages. First comes observation, then comes confusion, then comes comparison with past emotional patterns. Only after that does reflection begin. But this entire process only activates when the emotional dynamic they were used to is no longer recognizable. That is why behavior change alone is not enough. Avoidants do not respond strongly to surface actions. They respond to shifts in emotional identity. If the energy they once associated with availability, attention, or emotional dependence disappears completely at a deeper level, their internal model of the connection becomes unstable. And instability is what triggers awareness. Another important psychological factor is familiarity. Avoidant minds are used to predictable emotional distance. When someone repeatedly returns to the same emotional pattern of seeking or waiting, it reinforces that familiarity. Even after separation, that pattern is mentally stored as unchanged. So when no contact is used without internal transformation, the energy pattern remains familiar. And familiarity does not create urgency. It creates neutrality. The system recognizes it as something it already understands. But when internal emotional positioning changes completely, familiarity is broken. And once familiarity is broken, the brain starts reassessing the emotional significance of the connection. This is where curiosity begins to form. Curiosity is the first emotional crack in avoidance. Not attraction, not attachment, curiosity. The mind begins to question what has changed, not because of loss, but because of inconsistency in expected emotional patterns. At this stage, the avoidance system starts scanning for signals, not obvious signals, but subtle ones. Emotional tone, behavioral consistency, absence of reaction, absence of pursuit. These elements become data points, and this data slowly builds a new internal perception. What most people miss is that avoidant individuals are highly observant. They may not respond outwardly, but internally they track emotional shifts with precision. What they cannot tolerate is emotional unpredictability that they cannot categorize. So when someone transitions from emotional dependence to emotional neutrality, the system loses its reference point, and when reference points disappear, internal reassessment begins automatically. However, this only happens when the emotional link is no longer reinforced in any form, not through messages, not through checking, not through indirect emotional signaling. Even subtle attachment energy can maintain the old pattern. This is why true impact is not created by distance alone. It is created by identity change that eliminates emotional predictability from both sides of the connection. When the system can no longer predict reaction, availability, or emotional response, it enters a state of reevaluation. At this stage, the avoidant mind does not act immediately. It observes from distance. It replays past interactions with new perspective. It compares old assumptions with current absence of expected behavior. And slowly, the emotional structure they had built begins to weaken. But this entire psychological shift is not triggered by chasing less. It is triggered by becoming emotionally self-contained. When there is no longer any visible or invisible emotional dependency, the avoidance system no longer categorizes the connection as stable in its previous form. That instability is what creates awareness. And awareness is the beginning of emotional reconsideration. Without this deeper shift, no contact remains just separation, but with it, separation becomes reinterpretation. The most damaging mistake in emotional detachment is not action, but hidden attachment that still runs underneath behavior. On the surface, everything may look controlled. Silence is maintained, distance is created, communication is stopped. Yet inside, the emotional system continues operating in the same direction as before. And this is where true weakness hides. Because emotional presence is not measured by visibility, it is measured by internal orientation. If thoughts still move toward the same person automatically, then the psychological connection is still active, even without physical interaction. This creates a contradiction between external behavior and internal state, and that contradiction weakens impact more than anything else. People often believe they are practicing distance correctly, but they overlook the small impulses that reveal dependence. The urge to check, the desire to know updates, the habit of imagining outcomes, or the silent expectation of change. These signals do not disappear just because contact is stopped. They remain active unless consciously replaced with a new internal focus. The problem is that most individuals try to suppress these impulses instead of transforming them. Suppression creates pressure. Transformation creates release. When suppression is used, the emotional energy is still directed toward the same target, only held back by control. That control eventually weakens, and the cycle repeats. True, internal change happens when emotional focus is redirected entirely, not toward distraction but toward reconstruction of identity. The mind must stop operating from a position of waiting and start operating from a position of expansion. When identity shifts, emotional attachment loses its central position in mental processing. Another hidden issue is expectation residue. Even after separation, a part of the mind continues to anticipate a return of previous dynamics. This anticipation quietly shapes behavior, tone of thoughts, and emotional responses. It creates a subtle loop where the future is still mentally linked to the past connection. This is dangerous because expectation keeps emotional energy alive. It prevents closure from forming naturally. The mind cannot fully release something it still believes might return in the same form. So instead of complete release, there is suspended attachment. Suspended attachment is more powerful than active longing because it is less visible. It operates quietly in the background, influencing decisions, focus, and emotional stability without direct awareness. This is why many people feel stuck even when they believe they have moved on. Another important factor is emotional identity lag. Even after behavior changes, internal identity often remains unchanged for a long period. A person may act independent, but still internally identify as someone who was emotionally invested. This lag creates inconsistency in psychological alignment. When identity does not match behavior, emotional signals become mixed. And mixed signals create instability in both self-perception and emotional output. The system becomes unclear about its own position, and that lack of clarity reduces internal strength. Real transformation begins when identity is no longer tied to past emotional roles. When a person stops seeing themselves through the lens of previous attachment, the entire internal structure reorganizes. Thoughts no longer orbit around the same center. Emotional responses begin to lose intensity because the reference point is gone. At this stage, mental energy starts returning to personal direction. Focus becomes less fragmented. Attention stops being pulled outward automatically. Instead, it begins to stabilize internally. This stability is what creates true emotional independence. Another overlooked aspect is behavioral consistency. Temporary control is not enough. The mind responds to repetition. If old emotional habits appear repeatedly in moments of weakness, the system reverts to its previous state. This is why inconsistency destroys progress even after long periods of separation. Consistency is not about perfection, it is about direction. Every repeated choice reinforces a new internal pattern. Every moment of restraint strengthens emotional neutrality, and every withdrawal from old patterns weakens dependency loops. Over time, this repetition rewires emotional response. The mind stops reacting automatically to old triggers. Situations that once created emotional activation begin to lose intensity. This is not because feelings are forced away, but because the internal system no longer assigns them importance. Another key shift happens when attention no longer searches externally for resolution. Instead of looking for answers in another person's behavior, the mind begins to stop asking questions that cannot be controlled. This reduces mental noise and creates clarity. Clarity is powerful because it removes emotional distortion. When thinking is no longer influenced by expectation or fear, perception becomes more accurate, and accurate perception leads to emotional neutrality. At this point, internal strength becomes visible through calmness, not reaction. There is no need to prove detachment. There is no need to display indifference. The state itself reflects independence. And this is where real change becomes irreversible. Because once emotional energy is no longer feeding old patterns, those patterns lose structure. What remains is a stable internal state that is no longer dependent on external outcomes. This is not about forgetting someone, it is about no longer being emotionally governed by their memory.